Welcome all, and thank you for joining. Feel free to share who you are and where you're joining in the chat. Hello, and welcome to Family Language Planning, a talk and toolkit. I am Dr. Xiomara Rivera Pagan, Director of Language Learning at Cricket Media. Cricket Media is pleased to share with you all an engaging dialogue focused on intentional language planning to support dialogues within and with families to support linguistic diversity. We'll begin with a question for the audience to share in the chat. How do you use and celebrate language in your home? Perhaps this is a question that you have considered deeply, and perhaps you are here today in search of ways to answer that question in a manner which resonates with you. The many languages and language varieties that can be present in our homes is only further enriched by the many different family models. Today, we will discuss how language conversations can be had within a family structure, vertically, parents and children, as well as horizontally, partners, spouses, siblings. Beginning to consider how you use language and how you can create space for language, especially with those you care about, can prepare you for some necessary conversations on linguistic and cultural values that can serve you inside as well as outside of the home. Before we begin, let's review our objectives. Outcomes: identify the importance of family language planning. Discuss different models of linguistic diversity within the home setting. Discuss different recommendations of linguistic diversity within the home setting. And reflect on strategic principles that will help guide discussion and implementation of family language plans. I am delighted to introduce our expert panel. We have Dr. Sylvia Jauregui, Simone Rescamp, and Michelle Giron. A little bit more about our expert panel. Dr. Sylvia Jauregui. Dr. Jauregui has worked in diverse education organizations, including a state educational agency and national advocacy group, and in public and charter school organizations. As an educator, she worked at highly diverse, multilingual Title I schools in California and Texas. In 2014, she was awarded a fellowship from the National Head Start Association in Washington, D.C., and in 2017, she was the recipient of the Center for Equity for English Learners, ED Fellowship, supporting research that focused on state and district level accountability for English learners. Sylvia received her Master's in Education and Educational Policy and Planning from the University of Texas at Austin, and her doctorate in Education and Educational Leadership for Social Justice from Loyola Marymount University. Her award-winning doctoral research focused on documenting the testimonios of Latina parent leaders in the, Latina parent leaders in the local control and accountability plan development process across 4 districts in Southern California. Dr. Jauregui is the Senior Manager for Public Policy at Subject, an online education platform focused on providing accredited high-quality education to secondary students. Next, Simone Rescamp. Simone Rescamp is currently pursuing her master's in social work at Howard University. She was an inaugural John and Barbara Jacobs Social Work Social Justice Fellow and an alumna of the HBCU Center for Excellence in Behavioral Health and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Simone's research interests include the role of Afrocentric pedagogy in the identity development of Black parents, and she currently is a research intern with Howard University's Women's Center of Excellence. Simone is a co-founder of 2 Black-centered organizing collectives, Healing Justice SB and Juneteenth SB, earning experience in organizing and systems building. And finally, we have Michelle Giron. She has 15 years of experience working in dual language and immersion programs. She received her undergraduate degree in elementary education with a focus and minor in Spanish language and cultures from the University of Maryland. She obtained her master's degree from the American College of Education in Curriculum and Instruction with a specialization in English as a second language and bilingual education. She is now in the role of first grade bilingual self-contained teacher, a first grade Spanish dual language teacher, and an English-Spanish language development teacher, and a Spanish reading focus teacher. She now works as a dual language instructional coach in a K-5 elementary school in Montgomery County, Maryland. Michelle Giron is the mother of two children, 4-year-old and a 20-month-old. She is raising her children bilingually and loves to encourage other families to do so as well. And so, in order to kick off our conversation today, let's remind the audience that we would love to hear from you all in terms of how do you use and celebrate language in your home? We'll be talking about this throughout the webinar, and we'd love to hear your thoughts initially, and then we will revisit this question at the end. Before we begin, though, let's hear a little bit more about our panelists and get a feel for their specific linguistic background. So, what is your background with linguistic diversity within your home and/or community? And we'll start with Michelle.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. I am very happy to be here. So my background with linguistic diversity, my whole life's purpose really has to do with linguistic diversity and embracing bilingualism. My father is from Argentina, and when I was a young girl, and he said to me, "I spoke your first few years of life in Spanish. I spoke to you in Spanish." But so he was always working, and it became hard I wasn't getting the exposure that I needed, and so it became hard for him to communicate with me in Spanish, and he ended up stopping. And it really affected me because I really identified as being Argentine, and I loved my culture and I loved the Spanish language. And so it affected me socially and emotionally. It's been my life goal to bring back my heritage language. And so, when I was in college, I worked in a work study group where we went to different elementary schools giving parent workshops. And there, having this experience, I would challenge myself to speak to the parents in Spanish, and I'd have my little note cards where I'd script out what I was going to say. But I found out that there was something called bilingual schools, dual language schools, and I had absolutely no idea they existed. So that really helped me know what I wanted to do with my career. And so I went back to school. I changed I had a major in elementary education, but then I changed it. I added on a focus in Spanish. I added on a minor in Spanish language and cultures. And I said, I'm going to do that. I am going to reclaim my heritage language. I'm going to learn it, and I'm going to become a bilingual teacher. And so I did. And I worked in, thanks. I worked in Tennessee in a self-contained classroom, and I taught in English and Spanish, and in Boston in a dual language classroom. And then when my husband and I decided to come back closer to home, I said, I am going to find that school that inspired me. And so now I'm at that school. It's been 9 years since I've been there. I'm the instructional coach, the dual language instructional coach at that school, and I absolutely love it. And I get to really help others maintain their heritage language from the start. And I get to help them become not only bilingual, but biliterate. And it's very exciting work, and it warms my heart. And in the process, I get to keep reclaiming my heritage language and get better and better each day. And now, like Xiomara mentioned, I am a mother. I have two children. I have a 21-month-old, and I have a 4-year-old, and I'm raising them bilingual. And it is the most amazing experience just to see how their language changes and evolves each day. And yeah, that's just a little bit of how linguistic diversity affects me in my life and in my community. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. My background's very similar to yours. I'm a child of immigrants. My first language was Spanish, but I have older sisters. So once I started school, I had learned more English and just after I felt like going through some subtractive schooling methods, I started to lose my Spanish. And so being a teacher, I had always wanted to be a teacher. And then one of my first years teaching, I had students that, different refugees, and I just saw the disservice that was done to, what we were providing them. And then I started questioning myself more, what does it mean to be an English learner? So my research in my doctorate really focused on the things that I'm passionate about, policy, parent engagement, and English learners. So starting to learn more about what it means to be an English learner, because it's such an ambiguous group, right? There's so many different needs throughout. But in terms of language diversity, I'm also a mother, so I'm raising my son to be bilingual and to celebrate it, because I feel for a long time, I grew up a lot, in California many years, and for a long time it wasn't celebrated. Even though I was not told specifically you cannot speak Spanish, just the way the different systems, and I would see like my cousin who did, I would see her track. So even though I was 5 years old, I could see this and I could see like, oh, wow, okay, so then I'm not supposed to speak Spanish, you internalize it. So now I'm very much an advocate for here in California and supporting just the different advocacy work and celebrating it, because I think it's just so beautiful. It helps with family, connections, but very much linguistic diversity is something that I'm very much a champion for. And also I feel like I'm a learner as well. I'm always working on my Spanish because I want to get back to my heritage roots as well.
Hey y'all, well, I'm Simone. I'm going to pause real quick and just for accessibility provide a visual description. So I am a dark-skinned Black woman. I'm wearing a yellow sweater today. I'm real excited because I have on my heart glasses so I can see, but they also look cute. So I'm excited about that. I also have locks that go about to my chin. And so if I'm to talk about language diversity, which I love this term, but also it's just celebrating yourself, right? Celebrating your home community. And so I'm super excited to be here. One, as someone who is now in the stage of my life to celebrate Black languages, in particular Black English, but also because it started as a little one, which I love hearing from y'all as well, right? So for me, I grew up in Oakland, California. At the time I was in school, this radical thing was going on in Oakland, which I did not know was radical at the time. I just knew my Black mommy and other Black parents was real involved in showing up to all these board meetings, because at the time I was in the public school system, right? It was also the emergence of the naming of Black English as Ebonics by Black social psychologists and thinkers and scholars. And for those who don't know, it's like this blending of ebony and phonics. And it was Black people naming languages that we have created as displaced people in the Americas, right? And so at the time within Oakland, there was this conversation on whether or not Ebonics should be recognized as a language within the school system. And if they were to do that, what would happen? Like, would that mean that teachers all of a sudden have to incorporate Ebonics into the curriculum? Would all of a sudden the school social workers have to involve that into how they deliver services? And it was a lot. It was a lot. And again, as a child, you don't understand that. You're just like, my mom is feeling real strong about this, and this is important to her, right? But it also kind of showed how there were all these discussions within the Black community of how do we talk about our languages? How do we let go of some of this shame? How do we not feel like we are in conflict with other languages of the diaspora, but also say this is a language that is important to us in this specific place? But then there's this other types of, I'm going to call it like how structural violence created this competition between Spanish speakers and folks like myself who spoke Black English or Ebonics in our homes, because the school district was like, we don't have enough money to provide services in Ebonics because we also need to provide money to people who speak Spanish. Now, of course, you could be like, why did y'all have to choose? But this is the way that school districts, right, and oppressive systems require, especially Black and brown folks, to fight against each other for very, very minimal resources, but then feel like we have to prove to each other whose language is more valuable, right? Which is not fair and should not happen, but that's also a reality of what happens to many of our children within the schools. And ultimately, Oakland decided that yes, Ebonics, which is now not called it anymore, would be called Black English, was worthy of being included in the schools and did require resources, but that was years and years long fight. And so that was my introduction to like, what is this thing? Which is just Black families being very, very vibrant and vocal about this. And then as an organizer, we were really intentional within Healing Justice Santa Barbara and within Juneteenth Santa Barbara to say in our mission, first and foremost, we are for the most marginalized of Black people. And that will always be darker skinned Black people. That will always be Black people who are LGBTQIA+. That will always be Black people who choose not to code switch. That will always be Black people who may speak different languages at home besides English. And we always have led with that very intentionally because historically, those have been some of the Black folks who've been marginalized within our own movements, right? And so in all of our work, whether it is speaking, whether it is creating children's programming, we did some work around celebrating and archiving the Black history along the Central Coast of California. We were like, we will write context statements for the city in Black English. That's how important it is to us to be able to share our stories in our languages in an affirming way. And also to say, well, I'm super proud to go to a historically Black college and university that also includes Black English in our classrooms. I think it's important to say, like, we don't have to have all these like advanced degrees to be like, our languages are important and they matter, right? So before I came to grad school, I was like, this is the language that I want to be involved in while I'm getting this degree to master's in social work. I can't forget that speaking Black English is what allows me as a person to name specifically what my needs are, for my community to name specifically what they have experienced, because the language, right, that was forced on us doesn't allow us to explain all of what we have lived and persisted through. So I'm super grateful to be here in community with each of you all and excited for these questions, because already I'm like, it's all moms on here. I love that. I got a kid too, she's 4. I have another little one to come in February, but I named my daughter after Zora Neale Hurston. And especially for folks who were really into Black literature, you know that Zora Neale Hurston was real intentional about writing her novels, but also her interviews of Black people in Black English. She would not alter what they said or how they said it for the reader. It was important for her to write people in the way that they expressed themselves. And so it's with that intention that I'm here with y'all today.
Fantastic. See, I knew we were already going to get up and running, and it was going to be an exciting next amount of time. A lot stood out to me in our individual stories about how certain similarities and differences. What's really profound for me is how we start formulating these ideas about language from the moment that we start to be conscious about what's happening within our families, within our society. And so it's really important to kind of reflect and think back about how we have thought about language, how language has shaped us, how language views have shaped us in the past, into how we look at language in the more present, and then how we pass that on to the people within our community. I personally, I'm not a mother, but I still have a family that I have to be very conscious of, like, how am I passing these things on to nieces and nephews? How am I passing these ideas and these concepts to my family, even my elders, and making sure that we continue to have these amazing and critical conversations. What's really important, and what Simone just kind of alluded to, and is the next question, are that with the best of intentions, hopefully, and sometimes not, there are some misconceptions that can get perpetuated, and there are misconceptions that can get perpetuated by systems, but there are also misconceptions that can get perpetuated within our own homes and with our own families and with our own cultures. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about what misconceptions about languages should be acknowledged in order to avoid perpetuating them. And we need to confront them in order to have that dialogue, in order to identify how we move forward. So Sylvia, if you can get us started, and I'd love to hear from all of you.
Definitely, yes. Some misconceptions, and this is coming from other researchers like Donaldo Macedo and Bell Hooks, like they've raised the point of like, language is often sold as this neutral tool for communication. And they say, and it's not, right? It's not just a tool for communication. Language is, as we were sharing through all our stories, it's part of a person. It's part of our culture. So to just distill it and just say, oh, it's just a means to communicate with someone, it's not. And it's very dangerous because as I was sharing, when I was like 5 in kindergarten, kids pick up on cues. And so I picked up unknowingly, oh, I can't speak Spanish here. So then children start to reject their home language, right? They pick up on what am I supposed to do? What am I not? And then as children are building those identities, it's very scary because then they start to identify with, I shouldn't speak, my home language. I need to only speak English. And so that's a very dangerous misconception of, it's just this neutral tool to communicate. I'm not sure if anyone else wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I can really relate to that. It's not a neutral tool, and language is always changing and evolving, and it's super dynamic, right? And there's not just one right way to speak it, right? And so in the context of family language planning, I really wanted to say that there isn't one right way to raise a bilingual child, right? And it really depends on your family dynamics. What does one parent speak Spanish, for example, and others speak English? Like, what is it going to look like, and what is it supportive of you in your home? It is really important to have enough exposure, and it's also important to think that English, especially standard English, right, is that language of power, and it can take over, right? And so we do want to elevate the language that we're trying to bring to raise our families bilingually in, right, and in various ways. Another misconception is we don't want to, have to have a strict separation policy with languages in our home. Like the kids are not going to get confused if a parent uses both. You can do that. You can. You might choose to speak to your kid only predominantly in Spanish, but when you're having a conversation as a family, speak in English, and that's okay if that's going to work for your family, right? So there's all these strict policies. Even in the schools, we used to have this really strict language. This is the English teacher. This is the Spanish teacher. But with all the research on translanguaging and understanding that children, they don't have two separate brains. They don't have an English brain and a Spanish brain. They have one linguistic repertoire, and in that they have language features, and they're using their language to communicate in dynamic and super creative ways. So kids aren't confused if they're mixing their languages. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to, especially if they're a simultaneous bilingual, learning two or more languages from birth. They are going to use one language to help them learn another. They're going to get creative, and they're going to use a linguistic approximations. My son, an example, he came home saying he learned the word chase at school, like they were, playing on the playground chasing each other. And he came home and he said, "Mamá, ¿puedes chasearme?" So he took the English word chase and the ending of a verb in Spanish, and he created his own verb in Spanish using English and Spanish, chasear. Some people might look at that in a deficit way, right? Some people may think, oh, he's confused. He's not confused. He's using his knowledge of language to communicate and to learn, and that's creative, and that's amazing, right? And what we can do is we can say, oh my gosh, chasear, wow, that's pretty cool. También se puede decir perseguir. We can embrace and we can expand language, but we're not going to be the language police here, right? We want to embrace the language our kids and our students and our families have. Okay, we want to embrace and expand. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, to add on to what others have said, I try to remind myself, right, that there is no, especially for Black folks, right, because that is what I know and the experience that I'm most familiar with, right, that there is no wrong way for us to speak a language we were forced to learn, right? So what that means, stuff is going to be shortened, if it's going to be real fast, if somebody's going to make it up, if somebody's going to use the same word to describe like 4 different things, like we're going to let that go, right? Like it's celebrated. And there's joyfulness in that too. I think especially for Black American folks, right? We often were not included within conversations of language justice. And that is a much longer conversation about how anti-Blackness operates and how the creativity of Black folks is not often honored, even within progressive spaces, right? But I think like amongst each other, we can see and appreciate the diversity of Black English because there's so many different like presentations of it, right? Like the Black English that I heard growing up in California, who spent a lot of time with my mom and grandparents who are from Virginia, is very different from the Black English that I now hear, you know, in DC, that someone else might hear in Texas, that reflects like the beauty of our ancestors, right? And like what languages they have spoken. And I think some people forget that when we talk about Ebonics or our Black language, it's also a way that we can be very intentional about like who we belong to and who we came from, right? And so I think that kind of gets to also pushing back on these narratives of deficit for people, many of whom, including myself, who do not know, right? Like our home country, we have this language that reminds us, right, of who some of those ancestors were that I think is super powerful. Like as a social work student and also acknowledging and knowing that social work has a very racist history, right? We could talk about how social work historically was very much like assimilation, right? And if my goal as a school social worker or someone within this field is, you know, I need to make sure that the students that I'm supporting like have employment and that they are accepted into community, however that is defined. There was a long time when social work approached Black language as like, y'all need to let that go, right? Like we can't be using that because we're not going to get to the outcomes of you getting a job, right? And if you even look through social work journals, you see like editors of social work talking about like, well, what should we do? Especially again, as people around the country, not just in Oakland, but also even in like Rhode Island and Massachusetts, we're having conversations about is Ebonics or Black English an actual language? And if so, does that mean that we have been pushing all of these Black children to assimilate as opposed to have conversations with them about self-determination so then they can actually choose if they want to code switch and if they are going to have that discussion or like discernment to understand that when we make those decisions, it's within like these wider systems of oppression, right? Like this is why certain places will require you to present this way. And you do not have to choose to present this way. But we want to make sure that Black folks, Black families, and Black children are provided with that choice and not just saying, this is your only option, not just saying, y'all don't even have a language, it's a dialect, right? And so we're in this beautiful time now, again, from where I was a child to where that kind of died down, because then like there was this success and then people were like, no, please don't have this across the country. And I think now we're in this stage now of like embracing this again, where there may be this shift. I think the other thing, I know something that was mentioned was how this term like confusion is often lodged in particular at folks of color when we're speaking home languages or blending or creating. And definitely the same thing as well happens with Black English, but I think that also comes to when we go to schools, when we go to libraries, how often are we going to story time? And I'll get to this later. And there's never books that are written in Black English that I can read to my Black child, right? So now it's almost like teaching my child that storytelling only happens in specific languages. And it's not the one that I would prefer to teach my child in or tell stories about Black folks. And that is really, really disappointing. And I think especially within the last few years, like especially again, my daughter is 4, so I'm reading all these children's books all the time, where I'm like, oh my gosh, there's all of these books now. Not a lot. Some of them probably are banned now, but more books than when I was a child that are written and are very proudly written in Black English and celebrate the diversity of Black English like across the country. And so I'm super excited too to share some of those books with you all, because I think that also helps Black parents have something to hold on to that's tangible, that really pushes back on school systems, on teachers, on librarians, whoever, who may be using this language of like confusion, or like, this isn't the space to be doing all these different things, which I really appreciate.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. And we all, I think that you guys' direct examples, explicit examples about the misconceptions that either you find most profound or most relevant for this particular conversation, has everything to do with the way that we meet the moment, and we either get to, like Simone was saying, kind of elevate the conversation by talking about what is happening and hopefully have new conversations. And so knowing that, and Simone mentioned something at the very beginning about how language is essentially identity. Language is so connected with who you are. And many times I am very intentional, especially in these particular webinars, about highlighting linguistic diversity or specifically language diversity, because it often, I completely agree, it has everything to do with your identity, and yet we don't have as many conversations as we potentially can or should in order to identify how we're using language intentionally or unintentionally, or how is it coming into play in the greater society. And so those misconceptions usually have a human behind them, right? That human or that system is presenting those limited mindsets. It is tricky to deal with those limited mindsets, period. But it is even trickier to deal with those limited mindsets when we care about the person, and we have relationships with those people, and those people we identify as our families, and they are potentially the ones who are saying that language is right or language is wrong or language should be used in a certain way that you have identified is either in line or not in line with the way that you would like to practice language personally or within your family. And so I'd love to hear about, how do we have conversations to acknowledge limited mindsets concerning linguistic diversity with those that we care about? So how do we start to think about it ahead of time, when hopefully we have more time to reflect, to process, to think about how we want to address it, so that we can come into it with a space of empathy, but also come into it with a space of power to make sure that we address the situation in a meaningful way? Anybody like to start?
I think, it's sometimes you do have to have those tough conversations. One of the things is also, and Michelle, you mentioned it earlier, is just like the idea also that you need to speak a language perfectly, right? But I think even just modeling what it looks like to even be learning a language, or even to, say, oh, I don't know that much. I need to read up on that, and setting that example, right, for others. And also, I think the celebration of the home language as well. Those are just some ideas that come to mind. But yeah, I think sometimes you do kind of have to have those tough conversations. I mean, I think in Latino culture for many years, though, even in US, like school systems, you could not speak, your home language. You were punished, like physically in some schools, you were punished. And so I think there's like a generation that grew up saying, no, you can't. And but unfortunately, there's also, I feel like others that they just, frown upon that. When I was doing my research with the Latina parent leaders, one of them, she mentioned how another parent told her they overheard her child speaking Spanish, and they said, oh, why are they speaking Spanish? Like, I want my kids to know only English. And she said she got really like, oh, wow. And so she became an advocate in her district and with other parents, because she said, I don't want this. And she understood that it's okay to speak 2 languages. You know, it's fine, and you should celebrate your home language. So I think having those, and she would talk about, you know, having those tough conversations with other parents who felt like there shouldn't be a bilingual program at the school district because, you know, that wasn't the way to go. You know, their kids weren't going to be successful. So I think even understanding like a lot of the research behind it as well, it's shown that, you know, it's the bilingual brain or just even the linguistically diverse brain, like, you know, children are able to make deeper connections. I think, Michelle, you gave a great example of your son, like they understanding like the language structure, it's all connected. So yes, I'm not sure if anyone else wants to add to that.
For sure. You know, this is a tough question for me because I have a whole bunch of different stories I could share related to, you know, those that I love that don't understand why I'm raising my children bilingually. And it's been hard. It's really been hard, especially, and, you know, it's happened with both sides of my family, my Spanish speaking side of the family. It's happened with my English speaking side of the family. And like you said, you have to have those conversations, those courageous conversations, even if you're shaking, even if you can't get the words out. And I have froze before, okay, and not had the right words, right? And that's okay too. And you can reflect on it and think about next time, what are you going to say? And so I kind of wanted to just sort of share a story of what happened to me when I was visiting a family member that I really deeply care about and love my whole life. And I was shell-shocked when she started asking me some of these questions and making these comments. And it was really hard for me to know what to say. So I was at my family member's house for vacation, and I have my son there and my husband there, and we speak to our son predominantly in Spanish. We address him in Spanish. We talk to each other in English. We talk to our family around us in English. I was with my English speaking family. And my family member said, so when are you going to teach your son English? And, you know, that question doesn't usually, you know, baffle me too much. And I said, you know what? From birth, he's been hearing both. He hears my husband and I speaking English all the time, but we're focusing on Spanish right now. We're elevating the Spanish because we want so much for him to maintain his heritage language. We want him to be able to communicate with his grandparents and his family in Colombia. My husband's from Colombia. We don't want him to lose his identity. We don't want our heritage language to die with this generation. And so, you know, I explained that to her, and I thought everything was going to be fine. We were going to continue on with our day. But the comments kept coming. So then it's just like, well, he doesn't understand me. Like, why he doesn't understand me, and I can't communicate with him. And I said, listen, my son he's 18 months right now. He is learning language. He can learn English. Please speak to him in English. I'll speak to him in Spanish. You can speak to him in English. You know, he absolutely can learn English. And also what was frustrating in that moment is, you know, the language of love is love. You don't have to speak someone's language to show them that you love them, right? And in the context of children, the language of play is play. If you're playing with my kid, he's going to feel that connection to you. So, you know, she was feeling that she couldn't connect with him, and she was looking at language as a barrier. And that was, she needs to do some inner reflection on that, because she could have connected with him. And you know, and the comments kept coming, and tears were shed, and I had to, you know, stand my ground. And I don't consider myself a confrontational person, but I will not let anyone dictate how I use language with my family. And so I had to be true to myself, and I had to be real. And I tried to stay calm and explain my why, and tell her how much it affected me as a child, that I would cry as a child because I couldn't speak my heritage language the way that my family did. And I felt that part of me was missing, and I don't want that for my son. I want better for him. But you know, still, I mean, comments were coming like, well, you're in my house right now. And I was trying as hard as I could. And honestly, in that moment when we were kind of going back and forth, I don't remember what I said. It's like I have amnesia to it, but I knew that I had that courageous conversation, and I stood my ground. And I think she was feeling like left out or something, or that she couldn't understand. But we are always, including her. If my son said something funny, I'm going to say, oh, did you know what he just said to me? And I find ways to bring her in. But she doesn't have to understand every single thing I'm saying to him. I'm having some personal conversations. But if she wants to know, I'm happy to tell her. I mean, he was 18 months. I'm telling him, pick up your Cheerios from the floor. Do you want your milk? Like, it was nothing profound, but it's really, really hard. And there's not an easy answer, and there's not one right way to deal with it. And I mean, I'm still struggling with that. And it still creates an uneasy feeling within me. But, reflect on that question yourself, write some notes down for yourself, because as a parent, it's going to happen, and people are going to question your decisions. And so, be ready for it, and, and give yourself grace if you freeze, like I've frozen before. So thank you.
Yeah, I would say, to add on to what folks have said. So yes, like being courageous, like knowing like our values, valuing our identity, right? But I think I would add, in organizing, we know that organizing is relationships. And if I'm speaking again specifically for Black folks, because there's like there's racial dynamics to this, and I'm gonna be real honest, as organizers, we have a different approach to how we talk to Black folks who might be like, no, we're not gonna talk like that in this space, or we need to do respectability politics that we might have to folks with more access to power and privilege, right? So I think with other Black folks, we know that we're not going to throw other Black folks away, right? We're going to create community, create relationship, and then have discussions. Now, if I'm going to use the academic term, we can say like we was having consciousness raising discussions, but like other people say, we having kinfolk talk, right? Like this is how we communicate to each other. This is what it means. And if we were using standard English, we wouldn't be able to get to all of these textures of our experience, right? But the other thing that I think is very unique to the experience of Blackness and Black language and ebonics is while oppressive folks will be telling us that we need to speak standard English, they out here speaking Black English and getting money for it, right? And so we as Black folks can be like, what is the model of McDonald's? Their motto is, I'm loving it. No, is that standard English? No, it's not. That's Black English and it's ebonics, right? But McDonald's got a whole bunch of money for talking like that, right? Or even like a few months ago, because I'm in school social work, all the Black teens I saw was real upset that there was this white teenager all over TikTok. You all might know her, where she was like, period up, period up. Like she was trying to repeat all of this Black English and butchering it and not even saying it in a way that made sense. And it was really disrespectful. But she went viral and got all this money, right? And so if we talk about the beauty of being in relationships with our own communities, those who might be in different stages of like loving and embracing their identity, is we can use these examples to be like, well, who gets to own language? Who gets to name it? Who gets to like capitalize on it, right? Like who gets to be fluid in how we show up in these different spaces? And do we want to allow that, right? Like as organizers, is that cool with us, right? Like how does that impact or further exploit our community, again, already as displaced people who had to create this very specific way to communicate about ourselves and our experiences? For me, I try very hard not to disconnect the power of speaking in Black English and ebonics from like very wider, not systems, but wider examples of like organizing and resistance, right? Like it is very similar. And especially in relationship to what you were saying, Sylvia, like to persist in speaking in our languages, especially in spaces that punished us for it, right? Especially in spaces that marked us deviant, right? Or again, within social work or psychology, made whole diagnoses about these people can't speak the language, right? Like they need to do all this stuff to be healthy and well. I try very hard not to separate language from race, and not to separate the choice of languages that we use from ways that in particular Black people have resisted against oppression. And I think that story, but also that inheritance of like how many generations had to speak, use these terms, use creativity for me to use this language, right? And in particular around Black English, we think about how many phrases that we use, whether it's like honey child or whatever, that were specifically created in particular by Black women, but specifically by Black LGBTQIA+ folks, who for many times, again, were marginalized within our own movements. That is powerful to be able to use those same words and structures. I'm not a language scholar, again, like I'm an organizer and a social work student, but that's powerful. I don't know all the history about how all of these terms, but those that I am familiar with, right? And the history that I'm familiar with, that is pretty amazing to be like, wow, these Black women, these Black queer folks before me created these terms specifically for me, right? As a Black femme presenting person to describe like all that I'm experiencing. And that I feel like helps again within the context of these relationships, right? Because again, we don't want to throw Black folks away who may be in different stages of understanding like what language means to us.
Thank you all. And we at Cricket are very intentional about choosing who we choose. Some people are coming with that very explicit language background, but it's also to show the diversity of this panel shows how language is used within all of these different spaces. And so it is important to have language experts, and it is important to have organizers, and it is important to have educators and leaders, and it is important to have all of those different voices so that we are not thinking that these language conversations should be limited to certain spaces that focus specifically on linguistics. So that is fantastic. And what I hear you all saying is how intentional you are about how you use language to address certain situations, how you use language to challenge, how you use language to connect, to how you use language to practice joy, how you use language in all of these different forums. But the most important thing that I hear resonating from all of these conversations is that there is an intentionality because you have taken time to reflect in your own ways in order to identify how you will use language in order to elevate what it is that are your values. And so that is very important because language cannot be ignored as this background. Sylvia, you mentioned it, you used a very specific phrase, it's neutral, right? The lack of, it's often seen as this neutral, Sylvia, please share with us.
Yeah, it's usually, right, it's usually packaged or sold as language is just a neutral tool for communication, and it's not. It's, as we've all shared, as we've all experienced, it's not a neutral tool for communication because Macedo has highlighted how even your English learner that, learns English and is proficient, they still become marginalized. So, right, there's all these other layers, right? As Simone was saying, it's tied into race, it's tied into our stories, our histories. And so you can't separate, like you cannot distill it on its own. It's very much a part of a person, a part of their ancestors, about their history, right? Their story. And so, yes, I think, and even just us talking about each of the situations just shows the power struggle that happens when we speak, another language, besides what the dominant here is in the US, and besides English, it's very much, sometimes it's like, oh, you turn and look and what's happening here. But I think, having people that celebrate it, model it, even like if you are in the classroom, showing how you're trying to learn a new language, and that way kids can kind of perk up and say, oh, wow, okay, even my teacher's learning something new. That's pretty cool. So we can also set the example in that way, or us in our professional, areas, or when we are with our own children, maybe even getting a book in another language or something. So yes.
No, that's fantastic. And even the way that we talk about language has all sorts of power dynamics, even acknowledging certain ways of speaking as dominant or standard, or those ways in the linguistic community. There's a lot of conversations about how are we addressing language, and how are we, challenging, or how are we thinking critically about it. And so I do want to make sure that we have time to put into practice and pose to the team and the panelists specific strategies that they would recommend. But before I get to that, I did want to make sure we're coming towards the end of this session. And if anybody has questions, I see a couple of people have posted in the Q&A. And so please feel free either to share. It seems like we have a friend, Elda Cordon, and she shared about her personal story and how this is connecting to her. That's fantastic. That's exactly what this is. And this is being recorded. And so hopefully you find this not only meaningful, but somebody that you can share this with. So please post any questions that you might have so that we can address them before we get to the end. And before we kind of close out, I'd love to ask, what are strategies or resources that you would recommend planning for conversations focused on linguistic diversity, either individually or collectively? And I'd love to start with Simone.
Yes, so I was super excited for this question. And also excited too, because my organizing sister is one of the attendees, Letitia, who helped create this TV series that we started called Chocolate Baby Storytime. But I was mentioning, right, like as a Black parent, really hearing from professionals, right? Or when I went to library story time, I was never hearing stories about Black children. I was never hearing songs about Black children. And if I did, there were books and songs that were not written by Black people about Black children, right? Or they really minimized the diversity of Blackness. And so in response to that, we started with the first in-person Chocolate Baby Storytime. My babu, which means grandfather, actually came to do it in person. And we got to sing one of the songs that I heard as a little girl, just like Brown Girl in the Ring. It's a Black Caribbean song, but it celebrates like dark chocolate skin and children being joyful and being the same color as different plants. And it was beautiful, right? And then I finally met the only, or one of the few Black staff at the library after that, Letitia, who's on here, and she was able to take Chocolate Baby Storytime from this in-person event where we invited all different types of families to celebrate Black children. And she was able to leverage her background as an event planner and in film to create a TV show that now was shared on like our local television station, TV Santa Barbara, that has all different types of Black people, Black families, Black children reading books, mostly written by Black people, some of them in Black English to Black children all across the country. And so I'll make sure to drop that link below, but it's called Chocolate Baby Storytime. And there's a few books that I just want to shout out real quick that are specifically written in Black English. So one of those is Kai and the Electric Slide. I love that one. Not only is it in Black English, but it also talks about like collective communities, because Kai is like, I need to have a dance, like a dance that is my dance before this wedding. And so all of these elders in his family are trying to give him tips on how you cultivate your dance so you can like come out at the wedding and do your moves, right? But it's this beautiful story about how all of these people and collectives communities like celebrate this child, and they do it while speaking in Black English and celebrating movement. And that's a really, really beautiful example. There's also other work that Black social workers are doing. One that I like to use is this, like there's this emotional card deck. It's called Fam, Are You All Right? And again, that's Black English, but it has pictures of all these Black children with different emotions, and it blends in Black English as well, who are just feeling a whole bunch of different things, but it also validates, one, that we can talk about how we're feeling very specifically within Black English in a way that standard English doesn't allow us to. And that also is not included on those feeling charts. If you're like in social work or therapy, you know, we get these feeling charts and it has all the I'm going to call it, well, I shouldn't call it the white people words, but it uses the descriptions of very specific feelings. And that's not how Black people describe stuff, right? But this one actually includes it. And so I would encourage folks as well who are supporting Black children through social emotional learning to include these resources, also particularly because they were created by Black people for Black folks. So hopefully you all can check out our YouTube channel that has replays of all of those episodes and share them with your families and loved ones. You don't have to have kids to watch it. I love kids' books and songs. So like, just watch it anyways, and then share with a friend.
Thank you for sharing, Simone. You'll also get, I had shared a bilingual poem by, and it's in English and Spanish, something that you can do with kids or your family, but also something that I take from my son. He just, since he was he's 2 now, but ever since he was a baby, just loves music and just the power of music in celebrating language. And that's something that I incorporate every day. It's, you know, how joyful music is, right? You never ask someone, do you listen to music? You ask, what type of music do you listen to, right? Everyone listens to music. And so that's just one of those common, you know, threads that everyone, you know, that gravitates to. And so music is definitely one that I like to incorporate on a daily for my son.
I can totally relate to both of what you were both sharing, Sylvia and Simone. My addiction is buying children's books. I love children's books, especially my books in Spanish. I don't even know how many books I have. I could probably open my own used bilingual bookstore. So those children's books, bilingual books for our family it's key to helping us have a successful bilingual home, because it's exposing our son to all this rich vocabulary that we wouldn't use in just normal everyday conversations. And so, and it, you know, it brings about also such great conversation. I'm learning new words. He's learning new words. I have my phone out looking up words that I don't know what they mean. So it's just such a great thing to use in your home. And then along with songs, I can also relate. And I love buying children's books that have QR codes with songs on them. There are so many, well, maybe not so many, but there are a lot of them that, you know, you read the story and then you can look up the QR code and then it sings it to them. And I mean, I know my daughter on repeat has to listen to La Jirafa Rafa, which on repeat by, there's this publishing company called Nube Ocho. So they have some really fun books. But yeah, so children's music and children's literature, also lovely strategies to use to help embrace the linguistic diversity in your home. Bilingual story time, finding your bilingual community, finding your dual language programs, after school programs, summer camps, all that stuff, it, you know, helps in your mission to raising your bilingual child, but also just finding other than your home purpose for using the language with others, right? Other kids to play with, seeing that it, you know, it goes beyond just your family and that it's much more powerful than that. Let's see, what other sorts of strategies? Not sure, but it might come back to me in a minute.
And I think another one, uniting thing is food, right? Food, it's so, especially, I think it just allows us a chance to like bring back some of, you know, mom's, one of your mom's favorite recipes or grandma's favorite recipes. That's such a unique time for you to build that bond, and even and not just with your child, but maybe even other family members, like, you know, other traditions that you can have, and just making like a traditional plate, but also incorporating, right, how rich language comes into that as well.
Thank you. And we are actually going to share all of the resources. So if you were writing them down, hopefully you got a good place to start. But with everybody who participated today and anybody who is essentially registered for this webinar, we're going to follow up with a list of these resources. And so we'll tell you more about all of the resources that were mentioned here so that you can continue these conversations in your particular spaces. We also want to share that Cricut Media has language learning resources for all ages, and so you can explore that on our page. And finally, I want to give a big thank you to our expert panel. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Simone. Language is such a personal thing, and for you all to not only bring your personal experiences and your vulnerability, but also your expertise, and bring all of that to this particular space to share it with this audience. We are very grateful that you were able to take time out of your day for it. Thank you to the audience for sharing with us, and we hope to continue having these types of conversations and support you all. And there's thank you from Tracy as well to the panel for the expertise, energy, and experiences. Your stories are inspiring and informative, thought-provoking. I walk away with an awakening awareness. Thank you. A round of applause to you all. We agree. Thank you guys so much. And thank you to the audience. And thank you. If you watch this asynchronously, you still can receive those resources. So stay in touch with Cricut Media. Everyone have a wonderful night and be safe.